Elon. Elon's name comes from the Hebrew for oak tree, and our roots have a rich and complicated history. This area was first inhabited by Siouan-speaking Native American tribes, with the Occaneechi being the most dominant by 1650. So tonight I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Eno, the Tutelo, the Zaponi, the Okinachi, and the Shikari Native people. We are gathered today on land that was traditionally part of the territory of the Zaponi people in the Piedmont of what is now the state of North Carolina. This area is not far from the great trading path used by both the native people of this area and non-native peoples during the early years of contact. The Zaponi people, whose descendants include the Occaneechi band of the Zaponi Nation Indian tribe, still thrive and live in this region, officially recognized by the state government of North Carolina. We pay respect to their elders past and present. The Occaneechi people ask that you keep these thoughts in mind while here on our ancestral lands and treat it with respect, love, and care that their ancestors did, and as the Occaneechi Zaponi people do so today. Tomorrow we'll acknowledge additional Elon roots, but for now, Mikori Makichin Kihu, you are welcome here. And I will invite you, the Occaneechi have a longer land acknowledgement on their website, and it's worth reading. It's really rich. It talks about the many ways that they honor the land, have lived with the land, and for someone who grew up hunting and fishing and in appreciation of the land, it still very much resonates with me, but I think that it will resonate with anyone who takes the time to read that longer version. They did create the shorter version for use by our campus and others in the area, but I almost read the longer version tonight. And of course, there's a danger in land acknowledgements being performative, but I hope that through the centering of this land's history and the injustices that occurred here, it will prompt us to apply a critical social justice lens to our conversations tonight and tomorrow as we share and discuss our engaged learning scholarship and practices. I'm pleased to introduce a few other members of our Center for Engaged Learning team. Many of you interacted with Donna Camp at the registration table. She's the program coordinator for the center, as well as for the Center of Advancement of Teaching and Learning. We are the research center, and then CADL is the faculty development and much more center. You'll also have to have a shorthand somehow. So. You'll also see CEL's managing editor, Jenny Goforth, taking pictures throughout the conference. I'm not sure if she's made it in here yet. Yeah, she's right back there. So feel free to connect with any of us if you have questions, and if you want to learn more about our book series, make sure you talk to Jenny as well. So now it's my privilege to introduce tonight's speakers. Got quite a team. So Sophie Miller is a 2021-2024 CEL Student Scholar who's been partnering with co-leaders and participants in the 2020-2023 research seminar on re-examining conditions for meaningful learning experiences. And collectively, they are the leadership team for that research seminar. Sophie is majoring in psychology and minoring in early childhood and adventure-based learning. Eric Hall is Professor of Exercise Science and Director of Undergraduate Research. With Caroline Ketchen, he co-directs the Ewell Brain Care Research Institute, which has concussion advocacy and positive mental wellness as the primary goals. He was the 2018-2019 CEL Senior Scholar, focusing on salient practices of undergraduate research mentoring, and he's wrapping up his service as a seminar leader for the 2020-2023 research seminar. Ellery Ewell was a 2021-2023 CEL Student Scholar who graduated this May, and we miss her already. She has a major in psychology and a minor in exercise science, and she'll be attending the University of Southern California to pursue her doctorate in occupational therapy. Words are not always my friend. Buffie Longmire-Avital is Professor of Psychology and Faculty Administrative Fellow for Mentoring at Elon University. She was the 2018-2020 CEL Scholar, focusing on diversity, inclusion, and equity in high-impact practices, and continues to have some of the most frequently read blog posts on our site. So if you haven't read them, I encourage you to check them out. She also served as a seminar leader for this most recent research seminar. And then rounding out the team, we have Christina Wyatt, who also graduated this year, and also a SoTL Student Scholar. She graduated with majors in finance and economic consulting and a minor in psychology. And she's an incoming finance analyst at Capital One, and we're delighted to have her back for the conference. So now, please join me in welcoming the panel.
Thanks, Jesse. The good news, I don't have to introduce everybody since I'm first off here, so I can just go in. All right. So just one is, one of the major themes of this conference is trust, and that's obviously what we're going to talk about today. Just want everybody to pause for a second and think about what it means to be in a trustful relationship, and what does trust mean in higher education. So we're just going to just 30 seconds just to sort of frame, prime everybody for the discussion that we're about to go into. So what I'm here to do is to sort of set the stage for where trust sort of emerged in our research seminar in the past three summers. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of structural, why this might have emerged, but also a little bit of process why that emerged. And then I'll pass it on to the student scholars who will talk about their experiences. So many of you in here are probably not familiar with the SoTL research seminar sort of structure. So I think it's important for us to sort of think about what this is and try to help us sort of think about what we were getting into and why this is important. So these started in 2009. They've been running for about 11 years. And the general format is these are 3-year experiences with summer 1 trying to answer the question is what is, second summer 2, what works, and the third year is trying to come up with a conceptual framework or sort of vision of farther work that's going on. So there's great intentionality is trying to guide teams through this. There's usually 20 to 30 scholars that are international, from different disciplines from across the U.S. and internationally, to try to come in together and then try to work on a project. I had the fortunate experience in 2014, I was a participant in one of these research on the undergraduate research mentoring, and I think that really has informed my role as why I'm now director of undergraduate research at Ewell. It made some great colleagues, and made me think a little bit differently about the way that I just do my work and do my practice, and I think that's what these are really good for. So I had that experience coming into it, and so as Jesse sort of mentioned, we started off with the idea, if you go on the website, we had sort of 5 different positions, but the goal of this seminar, and I think this is also very important to understand, is it's looking at the outcome. It's not, we're trying to go from the outcomes of, the benefits of these things, to the conditions for. And I think that sort of set the stage initially for why trust emerged, because it's sort of, we're not thinking about what are the outcomes of, but how this happens and what's really important for us to do that. And so these are the 5 conditions, and I'm not going to read through these here, but I think what's also important to know is that over time, when Jess and I, as co-leaders, were thinking about the groups that people were going to go into, one of the things we realized is that one of these practices didn't really show up a lot of people. There was a couple people that might have been interested in integration, but I think the other thing that's really important when we have our 4 groups is you can sort of meaningful relationships. We end up breaking up into 2 groups, and I think that really says a lot about the importance of relationships when we're thinking about higher education and what it means to learn and to be part of this process. That there was a lot of interest in this, and so we had to break it up, and we sort of inherently had one that was sort of more leaning towards sort of faculty student, and then one that was sort of peer-peer. But then we also have connections in broader context. We also have feedback. We also have reflection. As far as these are the 5 groups that we have, where we really focus on these 4 meaningful conditions. So I think that even before things were started, we were starting to get this idea of the importance that was being identified as what relationships are and what are the factors that why that's important in higher education. And then early on, one of the first assignments that we give groups is to come up with an annotated bibliography. For each group, every team member, what are 2 articles that are really important or that are really interesting to you, and we put them together as far as a place where people have started conversation, and we give them those annotations before they can come on to campus. And one of the groups, one of the relationships groups, had identified an article, and this actually Stacey McKinnon was a member of that team at that time, put in this, and she came onto campus, and it really sort of generated a lot of interest. So I mean, so we have a little structure point where we have things that were in place that sort of are coming to place where trust might be important. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is our timeline, right? So this is the 3 summers. And I think this is sort of a little bit of the process of the structure. That's why it's really important also. As you can see, like COVID, sort of took out that first year. So there was just a longer delay. Teams were already formed. We were sort of pushing off as far as when we were going to put the start date is. And so from the standpoint that there was just angst that was happening with COVID and what was going on. And then our first couple of years, like our first year, we were hybrid. So, okay, we've been delayed. We're finally sort of in person, but we're doing hybrid, we're trying to do that. And there's not the, one of the things that's really important whenever you're forming a team is have that ability to sort of interact in person with people and these extra conversations rather than just over Zoom. So we had one of our teams was trying to do a hybrid. So we're trying to set up what are the times in the UK, what are the times in Singapore, what are the times in all these different places so that we can sort of have a meaningful seminar. That's really hard, right? And so that's on top of like what has already happened on people's campuses coming into there. So I think when people came on campus finally, or we started the actual seminar, after a year or so of teaching with mask or hybrid or whatever, that there was just a lot of like just people felt like they were missing out. That there was a lot of things that we were just sort of missing. And so I think when people start talking about trust, it just sort of inherently sort of gained traction sort of over time. It's like started with an article, started with some discussions, but then the more time that people talked about that, and then sort of had those interactions, started thinking where trust might fit into those other conditions, it sort of has evolved over time and sort of set the stage for where we are now. So just as, sort of being mindful of where we are, and this is not a comprehensive list, we have had from our seminar already, we've had a publication I think is in press that's about to come out, that in teaching, learning, and inquiry. We've had groups have done presentations. There's been multiple blog posts by student scholars and other people sort of talking about the importance of trust. There was work by our group looking at sort of doing a special section for teaching, learning, and inquiry from the meaningful connections, and most of our groups have agreed to sort of have a piece there. And then of course that there was that was one of the bullets in here in the call for presentations for here was we identified trust as something that's really important for us to sort of highlight in this call. Now, the other thing that I will say is that there's another piece that's sort of underlying here that I think also brought trust about. And I think, I'll pass on the student scholars to talk about them specifically. But we also tried to, I think for the first research seminar that tried to also focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in there. And so we really were trying to think about these issues and try to help people frame these in the context of what's going on, because that was what's going on in the national landscape. So I think that piece of it also brought trust along. And then the other piece now, the student scholars have been there and sort of, I don't think people really planned for it, but sort of like at the last, I wouldn't say the last minute, but we brought the student scholars into the program to also work with these teams. And so, from an outsider's perspective, or from an institution like Elon, we are very much working with students a lot in different areas, whether it's research, things like that. But for some of the teams coming in from different places, they might have less experience with that. So I think that sort of was like something where trust needed to be built and sort of be thought a little bit about. And sort of help out with that, I'm going to pass on to Christina, and she's going to start the presentation.
Hi, thanks Eric. I'm Christina Wyatt. As mentioned, I'm one of the Ewell alumni, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what signaling trust looks like from the professor's standpoint to students. Alright, so just to give a little bit of background, so it was July of 2021, it was a hot summer like you're experiencing in North Carolina, and we decided that we were going to be the first Cell Student Scholar team. I say we decided, I just remember applying and then getting an email over the summer from Jesse saying, hey, congratulations, you're a Cell Student Scholar, and I was excited, but I was also like, what does that mean? And I think that went the same for Ellery and Sophie. I'm not sure if they felt the same way, but we all kind of came into it thinking, what actually is our role? And that feeling of nervousness and excitement kind of transitioned into a feeling of imposter syndrome as we approached our first seminar, which I'm sure all of you have experienced at least one point in your professional career. So we kind of had to realize, how can we break down that feeling of imposter syndrome and change it into something more meaningful? And that's when we realized that trust had to be a big part of that. Some of our conference or seminar participants were talking about trust. I remember thinking to myself, I should have a light bulb moment. Maybe trust is something I should do with myself and the people I'm working with. And I think we all eventually, after like day 3 of the seminar, were like, okay, we need to have a meaningful conversation about how we can trust ourselves, trust the people around us, and really start to form meaningful relationships with our seminar participants. And I know what you're thinking, that's a lot easier said than done. And you think right. But there were certainly factors that we identified that made trusting ourselves and other people a lot easier. The first of which being our Ewell leadership team. I have to say, I think all the student scholars agreed that we had their unflappable trust and support the entire time throughout being a student scholar. They reiterated our importance to the seminar participants. They reiterated our importance to ourselves. I remember multiple times Jessie coming over to me and being like, don't demean yourself, because you are a valuable part of the team. And they made sure to remind us that we were the center of the research, so we had just as much stake as our seminar participants. In addition, they helped us to prep for the conference. They allowed us to specialize in one of the meaningful learning conditions, which really helped us to feel like we had stake in the conference too. Like we had all of this knowledge, and what I have on the screen is all of our annotations that we published online. And it made us feel pretty important. It also allowed us to have conversations with each other about what we learned, so that we were like, wow, you sound really smart. And like, you sound really smart too. And then in addition to that, we got to present on what we learned, not only at this conference, which is not where I'm trying to reflect on our presentation, but in our first seminar, we presented to our seminar participants, telling them how they should maybe structure their research and trying to center ourselves as leaders within the conference just as much as our Ewell leadership team was. It taught us to rely on each other when we learned to present with each other, and then we wanted to go a step further and rely on each other more often within our panel discussions. We decided the best way to engage with these groups was to be a panel of students as opposed to just being on our own, because if I didn't know how to trust myself, but I knew how to trust my team members, why not just learn to trust each other and then trust our seminar participants as we go? So we pursued the mutual support of a panel-style workshop. We were able to have each group come in one-on-one with us, and we got to break down the research. If there was ever something I didn't know how to comment on, I knew for sure that Sophie or Ellery knew what to say. So it was always great to have them around, and we were able to support each other in those less confident moments. And then as soon as the seminar ended, we began posting blogs about it. We wanted people to know about our experience. We wanted people to know that although it was hard and although imposter syndrome was something that we felt as students working with professional workers and PhDs, we were confident in the fact that other students could do it too. And that was just ready for the new cohort to come in. We had new SoTL student scholars that very next summer, and we were thinking, how can we make sure they avoid feeling imposter syndrome? That's where we started doing this through the eyes of a student blog post, which, shameless plug, please go read it. We started writing about what we had to provide, what our add-in was for being a SoTL student scholar, what we provided to you. And it helped not only bolster our confidence, learning about what all our skill sets were and how our backgrounds were important to your work, but also we were able to show off our skills to you guys. That way you could read about it before you got to the seminar. Additionally, just being able to participate in posting a blog was really important to all of us, because we knew tons of faculty members were doing it, but now we were able to do it too. And then we really wanted you to engage with our identities, which we published about, so we made a bingo board, which sounds, although silly, something that was really important to Elon. Elon has bingo all the time. It's something that every student looks forward to, so we wanted you to look forward to engaging with us as well. We wanted it to be as easy as checking off a square on a bingo board for you to engage with student scholars, although it might be uncomfortable, because we wanted to get to know you too. So that was our way of learning about trust, and I'll hand it off to Ellery to learn more about how you reaffirmed trust.
So, like Christina said, that we had already kind of set up a trust system, and that we were signaling that we were trustworthy and that the whole seminar environment was going to be a trustworthy environment, both for us and the participants to really grow in their research. So when we were discussing this, we talked about what we did to kind of signal that trust, and then we shifted to what we did to kind of build on that trust, especially going into that second summer. So we had the first summer, we had some hiccups. We kind of figured out some things that worked, like the panel But we knew we needed to keep that going for the second summer, that we needed to take that momentum and keep going, but grow even more. And I think that second summer was really where we were growing in the trust relationships that I think we've all built now. So a quote from our blog, as Christina said, go read them. So we left the seminar with rich connections to our participants and our newfound confidence in our roles as student scholars. So we needed to think about how to keep that going, and I think one of the biggest changes in us was our newfound confidence that we were capable, we did have valid opinions, and people wanted our feedback. We weren't just there, and people didn't really care what we had to say, but me, Christina, and Sophie all came from different disciplines, different experiences all around campus, and we were able to provide valuable feedback. So that was one way that we were able to reaffirm trust, was sharing our opinions, our feedback, our ideas. So now that we had established that panel format where the research teams were able to come to us and ask for our thoughts on their research plans, we were able to keep that going in a more informal manner. So I remember just popping into the research team, seeing how they were doing, just kind of asking for an update and being able to share my thoughts on where they were going, just in a more informal manner. But we already had that trust relationship of, okay, this is an environment where we're open, we're receptive, we're not just shutting down ideas, but we're going to take in all sorts of feedback, whether it's other seminar participants, not even just us, just from the other seminar participants. There's so much knowledge within these seminars, different institutions, different skill sets, different disciplines. All of that can really help develop research in that way. So whether it's other teams' feedback or our feedback, it was all a very open and receptive environment, and I think that was built in a lot of different ways. That was one of the biggest ways that we kind of helped reaffirm trust. And then also the second summer kind of changed for me, Sophie, and Christina, is that we had run a survey on these meaningful learning conditions at Ewell. So then we had our own set of data. It was a very new set of data. Seminar came, we were like, okay, we haven't even looked at it. But we were trying to kind of sift through that and figure out what we were doing with our research. So now, as the teams were working on their research plans, we had a research plan that we were working on. So we were able to, in the same kind of space as them, get feedback on what we were doing, which was really helpful because we were able to have all of their wonderful skill sets and contributing to our knowledge, but then it kind of made it a level playing field of we're all developing research plans, we're all kind of in this same stage together. So that was a really powerful thing for us to all be able to get feedback together, and now it wasn't just us looking at their work, but they were also able to look at ours, and that was really helpful for us as we were able to go forward with the next steps of our research and just having different skill sets, knowledge base. I remember just asking, what is the best way to show this certain thing, and having different seminar participants give what they typically do, because they have institutional experience as well as me, Christina, and Sophie have a lot of experience, but we are just students, so years and years of presentations and data analysis, that's really valuable for us in our growth as students and as researchers. So that was a really good shift. And then again, leaning into that informal, so that bingo thing that you saw, a lot of it was informal. Go see our favorite spots on campus, go see all of these things, and we got a lot of really great coffee runs and just walks around campus, and we got to all show off some things that we really love about Elon. I'm in my I'm sad about leaving college stage right now, so I was very excited to kind of show off my campus. And that's what I did every day. I just loved kind of getting to know the campus more and kind of having that student perspective of just being able to walk around and see our favorite place to study or where we get coffee or some places that we kind of live more informally, because that builds trust. That kind of breaks down the barriers of, oh, this is like a professional environment, but it's kind of like, this is my life, and kind of letting you into a little bit of my life, and you can see me studying or where I like to go get coffee. So that really helped kind of build trust the most, especially with that second summer, and having more participants be fully in person. That was also another really great way to build trust, that we were able to have those more informal moments. And it wasn't just always about work, but it was just about that kind of informal space and kind of letting a little bit into our lives, and then seeing a little bit more of the participants' lives, just chatting as we walked around campus, drinking our cups of coffee. And then kind of just a tangible thing that we were able to do. So 2 of our seminar participants reached out to us about writing a blog post together, which was a really cool opportunity for us, because it was just based on a conversation that we had had, and we just thought it was an interesting idea. And we were able to write this, I think it's a really cool blog post about social media, and especially because we have a lot of experience with that, and it was just genuinely an interesting topic. But we were able to tie it back into the research seminar, this new thing that we had a perspective on, and we were able to write it really quickly. We wrote it during the seminar week, which was kind of crazy when you think about it, but that was a really cool opportunity. And it kind of showed the trust now that not only do we have expertise about things, but we're able to kind of work on this professional level. And so I think that really helped us with any kind of remaining imposter syndrome, that professionals wanted our opinions on things, and also just how quickly an idea can turn around and be a collaboration. So it just came from a lunchtime conversation, I believe it was, to going into a full-fledged like academic blog post that we were able to write. So that was a really cool collaboration for us, and it really just showed these are things that you can do to reaffirm trust, that you're not only showing students that you're listening to them and incorporating them, but doing tangible things like this, writing a blog post together. That's a really powerful way to show that there is a trust relationship there. And yeah, anyone pass off to Sophie? There you go.
Awesome. I'm gonna lower that a little bit. So I wanted to then talk about the impacts of having a peer community adjacent to having these student-faculty partnerships. The student-faculty partnerships were something that was really special, but I think having a peer support system outside of that was what really made the wheels turn, especially since I was a first year when I became a student scholar, and so this was all really new for me. And so having extra support outside of also just this leadership team with Buffie, Eric, and Jesse, it was really awesome. So I want to talk about that a little bit. Let's see. So like Christina mentioned, we did a lot of background reading leading up to our seminar, and then throughout the seminar in the last couple summers. One of the books that we spent a lot of time kind of going through is The Power of Partnerships, and so that really stuck out to me as something that I wanted to talk about today as kind of the base point, because it talks about breaking down those power struggles. Here we go. In this acronym, so positionality, openness, willingness to invest time, ethnocentricity, and reflexivity. And while all of these were things that were highlighted as components of creating a meaningful partnership between students and faculty, it was also something that required a lot of working through with my peers. So I wanted to break that down a little bit more. Hello? There we go. So for positionality, it takes a lot of vulnerability to be able to talk about your position. So me, Christina, and Ellery all share the positionality of being students, which is something really unique in this seminar context with faculty. But we also each possess different kinds of backgrounds and identities, and that was something that we really harped on because we saw it as something that we could use as our advantage. And so we published a blog post that I'll mention again, sorry guys, where we talked about the expertise that we bring, the different backgrounds that we bring. But I just want to pose the question of how would you feel if you were just by yourself and you had to talk about what identities you bring to the table all by yourself? It's a little intimidating. So having each other to lean on and say, as a group, this is what we bring to the table, sets us up in a different way, builds our confidence in a different kind of way. That leads right into our openness. When we're at those tables and conversations with adults, like real big adults, having each other to lean on was really important. It was just good to know that if whatever comes out of my mouth, my peers are going to support me and say, yeah, I have her back. And then willingness to invest time. We're all students. We're all, juggling our on-campus jobs, full course loads, roommate drama, like all sorts of stuff. And so being able to talk about those things with our peers, knowing that they're going through the same thing, it was really motivating, and it was good accountability to say, this is a partnership that also matters. And I'm putting in the time, and so you should too, and let's go to Oak House and grab a coffee and work on this work together. Because it's hard to make those times outside of it. And then ethnocentricity, it's really scary to have conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion sometimes, especially when you think that the people around you have more experience. And so having a space that's safe and you know that you can kind of start to dabble in these conversations and take these risks with your peers first, or practice maybe accountability conversations that you want to have with adults. Not that we're not adults, but it was really impactful. And then lastly, leaning back onto that safe space, reflexivity. It was really important that we had this extra space to think about, how is your partnership? How are your partnerships going? Well, talking about the good, the bad, what you think could be improved on,
while that's something that we could do on our own, having the actual conversations about it with other people that are also going through it was really awesome. And so I'll just end off by saying that encourage y'all to think about what kind of cohorts your students might have or may not have, and how can they find them, and if you're a student, what kind of cohorts can you reach out to get support on in your partnerships with faculty.
Not quite sure how I follow our students. I told Eric. Sneaky. But if I could bring just maybe a little levity, if you've read any of my blogs or had a conversation with me, you know I speak in metaphors, and it's gotten me this far, so why stop? But I want to just hopefully bring together all that has been presented so far, including the powerful testimony of our students, and push that out into a framework or an understanding that not only were we including students in this gorgeous dynamic, but we were also researchers coming from a variety of different institutions across the globe. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the importance of positionality. And I think talking and reflecting about positionality is really important when we really think about how much we center diversity, equity, and inclusion in this seminar in a way that I think it has not been intentionally done before. So I am going to try and do this by framing out and relying on my love, particularly my children's love, of the Spider-Verse. So no spoiler alert, there is more than one Spider-Man, right? I did not ruin the movies by putting this slide up here. But if you think about multi-institutional research as a Spider-Verse, what we have to acknowledge is the fact that we're all coming as our own maybe Peter Parker, Miles Morales, or Gwen Stacy. And what that means is we're all bringing our positionalities, and to create trust, even to start from the very beginning, that Genesis is about negotiating those various different forms of positionalities, perhaps in ways we haven't had to negotiate before. And this means that we are figuring out ways to merge the fact that we are all main characters, that we all have our various different stories, and our needs, various different needs within the research space. So I want to kind of pause a little bit on one of those Spider-Mans, and that Spider-Man is Miles Morales. So Miles Morales has a name that is not Peter Parker. In fact, you'll find out that it's kind of a fluke that he even became a Spider-Man, because the canon suggests that you need to be Peter Parker. But by having Miles in this Spider-Verse, by having this different, dynamic, new perspective, his abilities far exceed what we've seen before. And in fact, you don't really know what's coming next because the canon has yet to be written. However, at the same time, we have to figure out how to make room for Miles within that canon. And to do that, you have to be thinking about not only, I think I missed the importance of positionality and equity in doing that. And not in just the research topics that we are pursuing, but the ways in which we engage in each other. Now, I put this picture up here because I will take any opportunity to put my children. They're kind of sort of cute. The dog's still cute. The other one's getting towards teenager, so I don't know. But why this is so important, because the reason why I fell in love with the Spider-Verse is that I took my children to this movie on a rainy day because they were climbing up a wall and I needed to contain them in some way. And for about 2 hours they sat mesmerized. And they sat mesmerized, yes, because of the flashy graphics and it's Spider-Man, but they sat mesmerized because it was a Spider-Man that looked like them, right? They saw themselves for the first time in the canon. They'd never seen that before. I never experienced that as a child. That is a great and powerful privilege that so many have and so many of us don't have. And so when the next movie came out, we were right there, and we saw the other little boy who was going through the entire movie, and his father was doing it just as much as him, because there's just something so dynamic and quenching of a thirst that you didn't know that you have when you see yourself. And so why I center here is because when we think about research, we often do not think about the fact that it is so heavily focused on Western, European, industrialized, developed spaces, that the amount of research that is out there in the world is primarily done by a small number of researchers representing a even smaller number of countries. And what was intentionally done in the Cell seminar, both this one and others, is to break out of that dynamic. But in order to break out of that dynamic fully, to move from intentionality to reality, we really needed to be strategic in the ways we were centering a reflection and a focus on positionality, on whose voice needed to be centered and why. What you needed at that time in terms of your own career development, what you needed in terms of seeing yourself or the communities that you represented reflected in the research, and the affirmation of also having your peers see the importance of that as well. And so a lot of the work that we did in addition to creating space, but I think what really perhaps was the underlying factor for this ability for trust to merge out was to really hold accountability, to really hold our participants accountable to the ideas of thinking about their own positionalities, to thinking about why they were asking certain questions, why they were researching or creating a methodology and the way that they were doing. Now, I say the term positionality and people are thinking, well, it's just those identities that I bring, but it's a little bit more than that. If you were to really get a definition of positionality, it's the social and political context that creates your identity in terms of your race, class, gender, sexuality, nationality, and ability status, as well as your privilege or lack of it. Positionality is also describing how your identity influences and potentially biases your understanding of and outlook of the world. So we're bringing in all of these various researchers and students with their positionalities. They're all their own Peter Parkers or Gwen Stacy's or Miles Morales, and we had to create a space that allowed for a new positionality of intersectional and shared positionality to grow. This has been urged before. We are not the pioneers of this work. You are seeing the diverse learning environments model from Hurtado and colleagues that talks about the fact that when we're thinking about the relationships and the building of trust with students, we need to think about not only the identities that they're bringing with us, but our own identities. We need to think about the various different layers that shape the higher education campus community and how those all cycle or trickle down to infuse that relationship in that moment. Why I think positionality is so important in this research is because our positionality, whether we know it or not, is the first and perhaps primary textbook that we use or instrument that we use in terms of thinking through this work. So when you think about, again, the fact that trust bubbled up for many, it was also because we were actively working on building trust in this context. It's going to then, this positionality, this experience and vision is shaping, again, that research process. And it is the thing that shapes even the subsequent reporting of the findings that you have. So I'm making us exist in that metaverse, in that spider-verse intentionally. It worked for us this time, but think about when we don't intentionally engage that and what that might mean in terms of the output that we have. By centering on positionality, by really making that central, we were also then able to truly have conversations about equity. And so what we did was not just focus on DEI, which sometimes people think is one thing, but actually really thought about DEI as it should be, which is deconstructed: diversity, equity, and inclusion. And to get to equity, it meant thinking about the ways in which we engage direct confrontation and mediation, how we were redistributing space and time and need, how we were prioritizing when we were having conversations, what conversations took place. It was very interesting to see groups that were working in one time zone, and then they had a member working in another time zone. And I remember those comments where they said, well, we'll do this, and you're giving us great feedback, but we're not going to change anything until we have that 1 hour where we can kind of overlap and have that collective conversation together, right? Because you are engaging all these elements of equity and prioritizing voice. You're also recognizing that the situation was challenging, right? But it was a situation that we could evolve and we could push through if we focused less about trying to get people onto our side of the agreement and more so focused on the actual conditions at hand, which again shifts us out of that space of being so outcome driven to thinking about the conditions that you need. Other ways we try to intentionally, maybe a little subconsciously, support the development of an equity-minded lens, as well as one that was infused with positionality, is that we created opportunities for actual creation. You can ask me later about sip and paint. It's a fun thing. When I do it with my students, they do not sip on anything but water. We also moved out of this space. We went on a field trip. We went to the International Civil Rights Museum, and I think that that was one of the most powerful moments that as a group that we had in thinking about where the emergence of equity, particularly in this area, stems from. And are you seeing that? Are you giving justice to this idea in your research? We brought in other voices, so it wasn't just a leadership team. Yes, we talked about our own experiences around these topics of equity, diversity, and inclusion, but we also made a point of highlighting other faculty and staff who were doing exceptional work in DEI, particularly for identities that you cannot necessarily visibly see, and we often forget those identities. And then, pulling back on what Sophie said, we also encouraged our group to do a lot of reflection and a lot of journaling, because this work is not just about taking notes or knowing the right definition or asking the right people. It is a constant form of reflection and questioning about yourself and how your positionality may be changing or evolving over time. And then we followed up on the idea that the methodology, the research plan needed to be equity-minded. And sometimes that was challenging, because sometimes convenience can get you through a lot faster, but convenience might mean that you are missing critical voices that are the Miles Morales that have not been included before but have so much to offer. So if we did all that, the hope was at the end of this, and perhaps the participants will tell me whether or not this is true, but in thinking about trust in general and the research process and the conditions for meaningful learning, I think that you can't have that trust if you're not intentionally centering equity and acknowledging positionality. And when you do that, you're not only creating space, but you're creating mutual vulnerability. And vulnerability is this joint willingness to surrender one's desire to remain in a position of power. That's the condition that trust needs to emerge in. You have to be able to surrender your position of power. If you can do that, I think that you can even move to what Brantmeyer and colleagues call the pedagogy of vulnerability. And when all that is said and done, My hope is that that mutual vulnerability, that pedagogy of vulnerability can blossom. And it not only drives the development of trust, it is at the very least a critical leap of faith. Thank you.
To our panel. You can imagine what a privilege it's been to work with these folks for the last couple of years and with the teams that they've been describing in these interactions. We do have a few minutes that we can entertain some questions, if anyone would like to ask any questions of the panel. While you're thinking, I will say that that critical leap of faith, I always say that the research seminars themselves are a leap of faith, to be willing to collaborate with people that you've never met before, who come from different disciplinary backgrounds and different institutions. And then you add everything that we added to the mix in this one, and it really is a critical leap of faith, not just a leap of faith, but a critical leap of faith.
Are you all, I'm assuming the Scholars Program is continuing on. Will you all be mentoring any future student scholars or setting that up in some way?
Yeah, so this past year, let me rephrase that. So every year there's a new seminar that starts, and so then there's 2 new student scholars that are selected, and then they carry out for their next 3 years. And so when they came into play, there was a lot of conversation about what worked well for us and trying to help them create the ideas that they want to follow through with. Now there's another group of student scholars that just started this past spring again, and so it'll kind of be an ongoing process. Ellery and Christina are graduated, so it'll just be me and the new 4 students, but it's become a really nice, bigger community. It's really transformed throughout our 3 years. So.
I wonder if you could talk more about your equity-minded research plan. So what were some of the kind of key features of that plan that you really focused on to make sure to keep equity at the forefront of your research?
Absolutely. So I think first and foremost is thinking about just the question that you're asking. Is that question set up in a way that is potential for strength and what I would call cultural capital wealth highlighting, or are you coming more from a deficit perspective? So that notion, I think Gorski talks about one of the detours on equity is that we tend to want to fix people instead of fixing the injustices. And so really trying to have conversations and pull out the question that you're asking in and of itself. How is this advancing? How is this showcasing what is already being done by community members as opposed to seeing where people are lacking? The next was thinking about that recruitment. Who are the participants that who are the participants you're intending to engage with? How are you recruiting them? How are you ensuring that their voice is included? Again, if you're thinking about doing research across multiple institutions, for example, do you have a variety of institutions represented? For example, at Elon, we have our lovely list of peer and aspirant institutions, and here's the funny thing, they all look quite similar. It's probably done intentionally, but thinking about HBCUs or minority serving institutions, thinking about if you are working with institutions that are not within the U.S., what are the factors around diversity, equity, inclusion, and representation that you need to think there, and how are you including that in? Thinking about the terminology that you're using as well, and how that is expected to move across these various different institutions. And then this trickles down into the ways that you are were analyzing the data, how you were getting feedback, the idea that we were bringing in students, but also that we ourselves were available to do that feedback. And then we had really interesting conversations even about the special interest, the special issue, in terms of places where this research could be showcased, and also, are we only showcasing the same people? Who do we need to be bringing in? Again, who is outside of the canon, but should absolutely be in that, or making the canon much more reflective. So it was intentional throughout. And again, that will often factor into where you are in your career and what you have the ability to do. So we were also thinking about this from a holistic and compassionate space as well. I think sometimes that's lost in those conversations, and that framing around equity has to always be there.
I don't know if this is too personal a question, but I would love to see, like, to hear your stories about transferal. Like, how did these things, these experiences, and these multi-cohorted experience move out towards your own lives and towards your educational journeys? Yeah, that's for the students.
I think one thing that was really helpful to me, so Jesse mentioned that I'm going to graduate school, so in the interview process and the application process, I think a lot of the reflection that we do was really helpful, in the seminars, just kind of reflecting on what it is that really helped in kind of the application process, but also just I'm not bad at talking to people, that's not, I'm very good at it actually, but interacting with faculty, I was extremely comfortable. I think to the point where some people that were interviewing me were kind of almost surprised at how comfortable I was talking to faculty, especially when other students were interviewing in bigger schools and they didn't have as many close relationships with faculty, but me being able to talk about experiences where I was doing research as kind of a peer to faculty members, being extremely involved in higher education, because I think you can be a college student and not really understand a lot of the workings of a university, and being involved with SEL really gave me a bigger picture of what faculty actually do and how university works and what's important, what they prioritize, and how things advance. You can just go to class and not really learn anything about higher education as a whole, and I think being involved with SEL really helped me deeply understand higher education and how it works and how research works, especially because even though I had my own personal undergraduate research project, this was collaborative research from totally different areas, so that was a different experience for me. So I think it gave me a lot more understandings of kind of how interactions in higher education work, which I think did a really good job for me when I was interested in going further in higher education, and if I ever decide to teach or anything like that, I have kind of a good understanding of how to be, how to work with people in kind of the way that higher education works. And then, that's all I have to say. Keep going, but
Hi, so I'm not pursuing graduate school as of right now, but I am going into the working world, which is exciting, but also kind of very different than what we did within our research seminars. So being within finance, I talk a lot about how finance is not iterative whatsoever, and it actually is very target-based. We are optimization freaks, you can see within any of my Excel files, which means we don't oftentimes reflect on the work that we're doing, and we have this black box that exists, so we don't really know what we did, but we know that it's going to get us to the outcome as fast as possible and not waste capital. That's not the best way to think, especially after witnessing 2008. And I'm sure after everything that the government has been passing about the debt ceiling, I'm sure you don't want to go into further debt. So as someone now working for a bank, I like to talk a lot with executives. I'm working under the CFO. I want to talk about how we can iterate, how we can reflect on what we're doing, and how we can meaningfully operate to make a sustainable difference, not just a momentary difference. So that's been awesome.
I guess I'll take my turn as well. when I started as a student scholar, like I said earlier, it was in the end of my freshman year, so I had not thought about my other undergraduate experiences yet. And that was something that I started to think about that following summer. And then when I was creating my research project, Jessie encouraged me to think about how I could link the two together, because it's just a lot to think about, two very different kinds of research projects. So one of my interests is early childhood education, and when I was developing my research, I was thinking about reflection. That's something that I focused on in the higher education research and the seminar, and how does that translate to 3-year-olds? And that has carried through really well and has been something that's been a really cool process, not only just for my sake, but also when we're working in the seminar and talking with the reflection group and specifically, you know, I'm able to contribute my own kinds of input and different kinds of perspectives. So that's been really cool and beneficial as well. And we also get to go to conferences and you get to interact with a lot of different kinds of scholars. That's been really helpful for forming my idea of what I want to do in my future too, and just having other kinds of support people outside of Elon and within Elon who I wouldn't have interacted with otherwise has been really awesome.
Thank you all. That reflection seems like a beautiful spot to end. So please join me in one more round.